The airplane cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy. Passengers settling into their seats, flight attendants guiding latecomers, and the faint hum of the engines building anticipation. James Carter, a middle-aged businessman dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, adjusted his tie and settled into his first-class seat. He relished the perks his status afforded him: comfort, priority boarding, and perhaps most of all, a sense of superiority over the crowd crammed into coach. As James leaned back, a tall, muscular man entered the cabin. His uniform, pressed and polished, bore the insignia of the U.S. Army. He walked with quiet confidence, his dark skin and commanding presence drawing a few glances from the other passengers. James noticed him immediately, his lips pressing into a thin line as the soldier approached. When the man reached the seat beside him, James felt his irritation rise. "Excuse me," the soldier said politely, nodding toward the window seat. James barely moved, his face set in a mask of disapproval. "You're sitting here?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. "Yes, sir," the soldier replied, maintaining his composure. "That's my seat." With an exaggerated sigh, James stood, stepping aside as the man slid into his seat. James didn't bother to hide his annoyance, muttering under his breath as he sat back down. The soldier glanced at him but said nothing, his calm demeanor only serving to fuel James's silent resentment. As the plane taxied toward the runway, James couldn't help but glance at the man beside him. His uniform, his posture, and the quiet strength he exuded made James feel inexplicably uncomfortable. "So, you're one of those people?" James said abruptly, breaking the silence. The soldier turned his head, his expression neutral. "I'm sorry, sir." "One of what people?" "You know," James said, gesturing vaguely. "The type who thinks they're better than everyone else because they wear a uniform. Acting like heroes, taking up space where you don't belong." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. A few nearby passengers turned their heads, their expressions a mix of shock and discomfort. The soldier met James' gaze, his eyes steady and unwavering. "I serve my country," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. "I don't think that makes me better than anyone. It's just my duty." James scoffed, shaking his head. Duty. Right. Funny how some people expect the world to bow down to them for doing their duty. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "It's not impressive. Anyone can do what you do." The soldier didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and even. "You're entitled to your opinion, sir, but I didn't join the military for recognition or praise. I did it because I believe in protecting the freedoms we all enjoy, including yours." James rolled his eyes, dismissing the soldier's words as the plane lifted off the ground. The tension between them remained palpable throughout the flight. James continued to make snide comments, each one more pointed than the last, while the soldier maintained his stoic composure. When the plane landed and the passengers began to disembark, James felt a sense of relief. He wouldn't have to endure another second sitting next to someone he considered beneath him. As he grabbed his luggage and stepped off the plane, he didn't give the soldier a second glance. But the next morning, everything changed. James was sipping his coffee, scrolling through the news on his phone, when a headline caught his eye. "Heroic soldier saves lives in mid-air incident." His brow furrowed as he clicked on the article, his heart sinking with each word he read. There, in a photograph accompanying the piece, was the very man he had insulted on the plane. The soldier's face was calm and composed, just as it had been during their flight. But now James saw him in an entirely different light. He felt a cold knot of regret tighten in his chest as he read about the soldier's bravery. And the events James had been too self-absorbed to notice. What had he done? James sat frozen at his kitchen table, the warm coffee in his hand forgotten as he stared at the article on his phone. The headline was like a hammer striking his chest, the weight of it sinking deeper with every line he read. The soldier's name, Staff Sergeant Marcus Hayes, was bolded beneath the image. The article detailed how a seemingly uneventful flight had narrowly avoided disaster, an incident James had been completely oblivious to during the trip. James scrolled further, his heart pounding. According to the piece, Marcus had intervened during a tense situation in the middle of their flight. A passenger in the economy section had suffered a severe medical emergency, one that required immediate action to save their life. The flight attendants, though trained for such scenarios, had struggled to stabilize the situation. That's when Marcus had stepped in. The article described how Marcus, calm under pressure, had coordinated with the crew, used his military first aid training, and even improvised with limited supplies to stabilize the passenger. His quick thinking and resourcefulness had saved the person's life, and the plane had been diverted to the nearest airport to ensure they received further medical care. James' stomach churned. He had been sitting a few feet away from this man, the same man he had dismissed, insulted, and judged with every fiber of his being. And while James had been preoccupied with his own petty grievances, Marcus had been performing an act of heroism that James couldn't even begin to comprehend. He reread the article, hoping he'd missed something, that perhaps this wasn't his flight or his soldier, but the details lined up too perfectly. The flight number, the timing, the description of the cabin. James' memory of Marcus sitting beside him, stoic and unyielding in the face of his cutting remarks, made him cringe. He put his phone down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The shame that washed over him was almost unbearable. He had spent the entire flight tearing Marcus down in his mind, and occasionally aloud, without knowing the first thing about him. James thought back to the soldier's calm, measured responses. He hadn't fought back, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even shown anger. Instead, Marcus had carried himself with a dignity that James, in hindsight, realized he could never have mustered in the same situation. But it wasn't just the shame that gnawed at James. It was the questions. Who was Marcus Hayes, really? What kind of person could endure such disrespect with grace and still rise to the occasion when it mattered most? James realized he knew nothing about the man, and yet Marcus had inadvertently revealed more about his character in one flight than James could have expected in a lifetime. Feeling restless, James began pacing his kitchen. He thought about the other passengers, the ones he'd barely noticed as he stewed in his self-righteousness. How many of them had witnessed the incident? How many had watched Marcus in action, while James sat in ignorant disdain? The memory of Marcus's calm demeanor during the flight haunted him. Was it because he had already seen so much, faced so much, that a medical emergency on a plane barely faced him? James picked up his phone again, scrolling through the article to find more about Marcus' background. His curiosity overrode his guilt, though the latter never fully left him. The article mentioned that Marcus had served multiple tours overseas, earning several commendations for his bravery and leadership in combat situations. He had been a medic, it seemed, tasked with saving lives in some of the most harrowing conditions imaginable. James frowned. He had always viewed soldiers as a monolith, faceless individuals who signed up for a job he didn't understand and didn't care to. But this was different. Marcus wasn't some abstract figure. He was real, tangible, and undeniably extraordinary. And James had belittled him. The guilt began morphing into something else. It wasn't quite anger, though it burned just as hot. It was frustration at himself for being so blind, so small-minded. James thought about the things he'd said to Marcus, the tone he used, the sideways glances. It all felt so petty now, so meaningless in the face of what Marcus had done. The article ended with a quote from one of the flight attendants. "We're incredibly lucky Staff Sergeant Hayes was on that flight. Without him, the outcome could have been very different. He's a true hero, and we're all grateful for his quick thinking and calm under pressure." James put the phone down again, this time more carefully. The word hero stuck in his mind. It wasn't a word he used lightly, nor was it a word he liked to hear. It felt overused, diluted by social media posts and feel-good stories. But in this case, James couldn't deny its accuracy. Marcus Hayes was a hero, and James had treated him like dirt. The memory of the flight replayed in James' mind like a bad movie. He remembered the way Marcus had looked out the window, his profile etched with quiet strength. James had misinterpreted that silence as arrogance, but now he saw it for what it really was, composure. Marcus had the kind of confidence that didn't need to shout or boast. It simply existed, steady and unshakable. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. What could he do now? Apologize? Reach out somehow? The idea seemed laughable. How do you make amends to someone you've wronged so profoundly? Marcus didn't deserve an apology born out of guilt or obligation. He deserved respect, something James hadn't given him when it mattered. As the morning stretched on, James couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this encounter, was significant. It wasn't just about Marcus or the flight. It was about James himself, the man he had been and the man he wanted to be. But as much as James wanted to move past the shame and regret, he knew he couldn't. Not yet. The story wasn't over. Not for him. And certainly not for Marcus Hayes. James couldn't shake the weight in his chest as the day stretched on. The article about Marcus Hayes lingered in his mind, replaying in loops that grew louder with each turn. He tried to distract himself with work, emails, even the mindless chatter of a mid-morning meeting. But none of it could drown out the gnawing regret. His thoughts kept circling back to the flight, to the way he had acted, to the man he now knew he had grossly misjudged. Later that afternoon, James found himself scrolling through social media, his curiosity about Marcus driving him to search for any mention of the soldier. It didn't take long before he stumbled upon a flood of posts praising Marcus. Passengers who had been on the same flight shared their accounts, calling him a hero and marveling at his bravery. One post in particular caught James' eye. A woman had taken a photo of Marcus quietly standing near the plane's exit after the emergency landing. In the caption she wrote, "This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Hayes. He saved a life yesterday, and he did it with humility and grace. I didn't get to thank him properly, but I hope he knows how much his actions meant to all of us." James stared at the image for a long time. Marcus looked exactly as he remembered, calm, composed, and self-assured. But there was something else in the picture, something James hadn't seen during their flight. It was respect. The other passengers in the frame, even the crew members, all seemed to radiate admiration for Marcus. And James had sat there, oblivious, letting his prejudice and bitterness dictate his actions. He clicked on the woman's profile, scrolling through her posts. Most of her timeline was filled with updates about the incident, and James found himself piecing together the sequence of events he had somehow missed. He learned about the passenger who had fallen ill, the panic that had spread among the crew, and how Marcus had calmly taken charge, earning the trust of everyone around him. But one detail stopped James cold. In one of her posts, the woman mentioned how Marcus had been sitting in first class beside someone who, in her words, had treated him with shocking disrespect. She didn't name names, but her description was unmistakable. James felt his stomach drop. The post had already gained significant attention, with people commenting their outrage and disbelief. Some speculated about the identity of the rude passenger, while others criticized the idea of anyone daring to insult a man like Marcus Hayes. James quickly closed the app, his face burning with shame. He thought about that moment on the plane, the casual cruelty of his words, the way Marcus had handled it with quiet dignity. James had been so consumed by his own assumptions, his own biases, that he hadn't stopped to consider the man sitting beside him as an individual. And now, the world seemed to know what he had done, at least the part of the world paying attention to this story. But it wasn't just the fear of exposure that gnawed at James. It was the realization of how deeply flawed his actions had been. He had always seen himself as a good person, someone who worked hard, followed the rules, and deserved the success he'd achieved. But this incident had cracked that image, forcing him to confront the uglier parts of himself, the parts he had ignored or justified for far too long. As evening fell, James found himself pacing his living room, his thoughts racing. He couldn't let this go. He couldn't just move on without doing something, anything to make things right. But what? An apology felt inadequate, almost insulting in its simplicity. He couldn't undo what he had said or take back the way he had treated Marcus. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from a colleague who had also been on the flight. "Hey, did you see the news about the soldier from yesterday? Crazy, right? Makes you think twice about judging people. Hope you're doing well." James stared at the message, his guilt flaring up all over again. He typed out a quick, vague response and set his phone down. But the colleague's words lingered. Makes you think twice about judging people. James thought back to Marcus's calm responses during the flight. Despite everything James had thrown at him, his pointed comments, his dismissive attitude, Marcus had never lashed out. He had met every insult with grace, refusing to stoop to James' level. And that, James realized, was perhaps the most humbling part of all. The conflict inside James deepened. He wanted to reach out to Marcus, to express his regret and gratitude. But how? He didn't even know where to start. Would Marcus even want to hear from him? And would an apology mean anything after what he had done? As he wrestled with these thoughts, James couldn't help but wonder about Marcus' perspective. What had he thought of James during the flight? Had he seen James for what he was, a man blinded by his own prejudice? Or had he simply written James off as another ignorant passenger, not worth his time? The questions swirled in James's mind, unanswered and unrelenting. He knew he couldn't ignore them forever, but for now, all he could do was sit with the weight of his actions and the growing realization of just how much he had to learn. The tension within him remained unresolved, a gnawing reminder that some mistakes couldn't be easily undone. And yet, beneath the guilt and shame, there was a flicker of something else, a determination to face the consequences, to confront the man he had been, and to find a way to make things right. But how?